Okay, it is time to talk about one of my favorite topics in world history, revolutions of 1848. And no, that's not a clickbait title. We are actually going to talk about all the revolutions that swept through Europe in 1848. So get your party pants on because it is time to do some history. Now, if you remember from the last video, Europe in the early 1800s was dominated by a few conservative powers who wanted to keep things just the way they were, but the seeds of discontent had already been planted and those seeds were going to grow into some major uprisings in the 1840s. And when I say uprisings, I mean a full-on wave of revolutions that would change Europe forever. So here's what happened. Starting in the late 1840s, there was a wave of political revolutions across Europe, starting with France and moving into Germany, Italy, Austria, Poland, and even Russia. It was called the Spring of Nations. And these were a series of mostly unsuccessful revolts against the existing monarchical, aristocratic, and church authorities across Europe. The people who rose up in the Spring of Nations demanded an end to aristocratic privileges, the expansion of voting rights and national self-determination along with other liberal reforms. Although most of these revolutions failed, they did succeed in changing ideas about politics and society in Europe forever. And before we start talking about all these revolutions, let me quickly explain why this period of time was such a tinderbox for revolution. First of all, you had a lot of groups in Europe who were discontented with their place in society. Liberal intellectuals and middle-class business owners felt that their interests were being ignored by conservative governments. Then there were the rising groups of factory workers and urban laborers who faced miserable living conditions and harsh treatment at the hands of their employers. Also, many ethnic and national groups across Europe felt oppressed by the dominant power in their region and they wanted more autonomy or even full independence. And finally, the ideas of the French Revolution and the American Revolution were still fresh in people's minds and they provided inspiration for those who wanted to overthrow the old order and bring about a new era of liberty and equality. Then you combine all these factors together and you have a recipe for revolution. Now let's meet the ingredients. First up, we have France, which has been a major player in European politics since the French Revolution. By the 1840s, France was ruled by King Louis Philippe, who was considered a constitutional monarch since he shared power with a legislature that was elected by a limited franchise. That means that only a small percentage of the population could vote, but at least there were elections. However, Louis Philippe was criticized for being out of touch with the people and for not doing enough to improve their lives. In fact, he was seen as a symbol of the July monarchy, named after the July Revolution of 1830, which had brought him to power. As a result, there was growing opposition to his rule from both the left and the right. The left demanded a broader franchise, while the right wanted a return to absolute monarchy. Eventually, the opposition groups joined forces and forced Louis Philippe to abdicate in February of 1848. This event is known as the February Revolution, and as a result, France became a republic. And then they held elections, and guess who won? A guy named Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, who was the nephew of Napoleon I and promised to restore order and prosperity to France. But while all this was going on in France, other parts of Europe were also getting the revolution bug. In Germany, for example, there was a long-standing desire for unification and independence from the rule of the Austrian Empire. The Germans, like the Italians, were a collection of different states ruled by various monarchs and aristocrats who often clashed with each other. But despite their differences, the Germans shared a common language and culture that bound them together. And so the idea of German nationalism began to emerge in the early 1800s. One of the main figures in this movement was a guy named Johann Gottfried Herder, who was a philosopher and writer who argued that each people had its own unique character and that this character was shaped by the people's language, customs, and history. He believed that each people should be free to develop its own identity and that this freedom could be achieved through a national state. Now, unfortunately for Mr. Herder, the German Confederation wasn't exactly thrilled at the idea of breaking away from Austrian control, and so they tried to put down any potential revolts before they started. But you can't stop the will of the people, man. I mean, just ask the Russians. Anyway, in March of 1848, a series of revolutions broke out across Germany, starting in the city of Dresden. The people demanded an end to aristocratic privileges, the expansion of voting rights, and the creation of a unified German state. But the German Confederation wasn't having it. They sent in the army to put down the revolt, but the army was slow to arrive and the people were prepared. In fact, the people had set up barricades in the streets and were fighting back against the soldiers. This event became known as the March Revolution. After several days of fighting, the German Confederation agreed to some of the people's demands, such as the introduction of a constitution and the expansion of voting rights. But they refused to give up their power, and so the people kept on fighting. Eventually, the fighting spread to other parts of Germany and involved hundreds of thousands of people. The revolutionaries were led by a group of intellectuals and students who called themselves the Young Germany Movement. They were well organized and had a clear vision of what they wanted, a unified and independent Germany, but they were also idealistic and inexperienced in politics. They didn't have a real plan for how to achieve their goals, and they underestimated the power of the conservative forces, and so in the end the German Confederation crushed the revolution. Meanwhile, similar revolutions were taking place in other parts of Europe. In Austria, for example, the Hungarians rose up against the rule of the Habsburg dynasty. They demanded more autonomy and an end to the empire's multi-ethnic policies, but the Austrians crushed the revolt, and that was pretty much the end of that. In Italy, the situation was a bit more complicated. You see, Italy was still divided into several states ruled by foreign powers, and the Italians wanted to change that. They launched a series of revolts across the peninsula, but they were poorly coordinated and ultimately unsuccessful. However, one of these revolts in Sicily actually succeeded in establishing a republic. It was the first of its kind in southern Italy, and it lasted for 2 years before it was crushed by the ruling Bourbons. But the point is, the revolutionary spirit was alive and well in Italy, and it wouldn't be long before it would rise again. So, that is a quick rundown of all the major revolutions of 1848, but you might be wondering, why did I leave out Russia? Well, that's because I saved the best for last. The Russian Revolution of 1848 was led by a guy named Alexander Herzen, who was a writer and journalist who had spent time in exile in Western Europe. There he had become a supporter of liberal and nationalist ideas, and he wanted to bring them back to Russia. His plan was to spark a revolution among the Russian intelligentsia, which was a group of educated nobles who were influential in Russian society. Herzen believed that the intelligentsia would be the agents of change in Russia and that they could overthrow the conservative regime of Tsar Nicholas I. Now, Herzen and his friends weren't stupid. They knew that they couldn't challenge the power of the military directly, since the military was loyal to the Tsar. So instead, they focused on winning the support of the intelligentsia. They published newspapers and pamphlets that criticized the regime and called for reform. They also organized secret societies and circulated them among the intelligentsia. Now their message was received by a lot of people, and soon there were rumors of a secret conspiracy against the Tsar. Nicholas I got wind of this, and he became paranoid. He started arresting people without charging them with crimes, and he even exiled Herzen from Russia, but it was too late. The revolution had begun. In February of 1848, a group of students and intellectuals led a revolt in St. Petersburg. The rebels fought against the soldiers and the police, but they were eventually defeated. And many of them were killed or imprisoned, so that's not good. But Herzen's plan actually worked. The revolt inspired other parts of Russia, and soon there were rebellions in many cities and towns. The peasants demanded an end to serfdom and the right to own land. The workers demanded better wages and working conditions. The intelligentsia demanded more political rights and the abolition of censorship. Now Nicholas I was in a tough spot. He couldn't crush the rebellion without the support of the intelligentsia, so he made some concessions. He ended censorship, he granted limited civil rights to the Jews, and he introduced some reforms to the legal system. But these reforms weren't enough to satisfy the revolutionaries, and the fighting continued. In the end, Nicholas I had to flee to safety in the countryside, and the rebels took control of St. Petersburg. They set up a provisional government and they drew up a constitution for a new Russia, but this didn't last long. The conservative forces regrouped and they crushed the revolution. The provisional government was overthrown and Nicholas I returned to power. So as you can see, the Russian Revolution of 1848 was more radical and more successful than the other revolutions of 1848. Although none of the revolutions of 1848 achieved their goals, they did have a lasting impact on Europe. They changed the way people thought about politics and society, and they paved the way for future revolutions in the 1800s. If you want to learn more about the revolutions of 1848, check out the resources. And as always, thank you for watching.